Je vois que... Voilà, on a eu l'enregistrement. Donc, on va peut-être commencer.
I think we can start. Good morning, everyone, at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, and we would like to welcome you to this sixth and last presentation of the UNESCO series of regional expert consultations against racism and discriminations. I'm Anna Maria Manuf, and I'm the interim head for inclusion and rights. I would just like to point out that you have interpretation in English, French, and Arabic, and you can choose the language by clicking on the globe.
Translation is available during this meeting, and you can choose the language by clicking on the globe on your screen. Je voudrais commencer par vous présenter un très
I'd like to start by presenting a short video which has been produced by UNESCO and which is called United Against Racism. The video shows you figures involved in combating racial discrimination, and you can find it on YouTube, UNESCO, and other networks too.
Many of us like to think of racism as something from the past, something that no longer holds sway over our societies, something that no longer exists.
But World War II took place less than a century ago. Survivors of the Holocaust are still alive today.
The Jim Crow laws were enforced until 1965.
L'apartheid a été une réalité jusqu'en 1991.
We live in a world where people face barriers to education, employment, health, justice, and culture just because of the color of their skin.
Where people are discriminated against, excluded, stigmatized, attacked, or even murdered.
Just because of where they come from, what they look like, or what they believe in.
No more.
No more.
No more.
Hoy decimos basta.
El racismo y la discriminación son causados por la ignorancia y el miedo a lo que creemos diferente.
ويخترقان هياكلنا الإدارية وثقافتنا الشعبية وتحيزنا وفرضياتنا اللاواعية.
But this doesn't have to be the case.
You, me, us, we can create the change that we want.
By defending quality education for all, we can combat the root causes of deadly stereotypes and prejudices.
By developing historical knowledge and critical thinking, we can improve our understanding of the past.
By encouraging cultural diversity, especially at the local level, we can build societies that are more respectful of others.
By empowering the younger generation,
we can help them shape the world.
So, stop watching from the sidelines.
Read, observe, learn, and listen.
We must hold ourselves accountable.
We must hold our societies accountable.
We are all one humanity.
Keep quiet is not an option.
Is not an option.
Di lo que piensas.
Speak up.
Speak up. Take action.
Take action.
Take action.
Merci beaucoup, Shad.
Thank you very much. As I've just explained, this video clip can be seen on YouTube, and I suggest you go and look at it and that you send it around your own contacts. I now have the pleasure of introducing Ms. Gabriela Ramos, who's the ADG for Human and Social Sciences, and she will be presenting the opening speech. And then we will have our moderator, Mr. Bishar Al-Gawi, who is Communications and Fundraising Director at Mentor Arabia. Ms. Ramos, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Anna Maria. And good morning, one and all. I'm very proud to be involved in this sixth series of regional expert consultations against racism and discrimination. This is the last one. We've had consultations in all the regions around the world. We had Latin America, Africa, Europe, Asia, And as Anna Maria pointed out, this is UNESCO work looking at the way racism and discrimination are expressed. And there has been an increase in such sentiment over recent times. So I'm pleased that you agreed to be part of this exchange of knowledge so that we can see how we can take action.
In the video. And so welcome to our speakers. Welcome to Monsieur Fassatui, Mr. Hareb, Madame Siski, Madame Mefla, Madame Moshba, et bien sûr, our moderator, Madame Alkawi. Fighting racism and discrimination is nothing new in UNESCO. This is central to our role, central to our mandate to promote peace in the minds of men and women. And we have a very interesting basis to build up the connaissance and to try to advance strong action against racism, starting with the seminal work by Claude Lévi-Strauss in the 50s regarding race that established no superiority of any race, going to our Declaration of Race and Racial Prejudice in 1978, and our programmatic activities like the Slave Route Project, the General History of Africa, the more recent masterclasses series against racism and discriminations, and the work of the International Coalitions of Inclusive and Sustainable Cities. So we have a vast array of activities and reflections to counter this evil. We also are launching a recommendation of ethics of artificial intelligence that is really trying, among other things, to avoid that the discriminatory actions and the biases that we have in the analog world are not translated into the digital world. And so we are also trying to move ahead, not only in terms of what we have now, but what the world of the future is going to be, and it's going to build based on more tolerance and more understanding. It has been race and discrimination has been a prevalent issue in our history. It's not that it's something new, but we know that with the COVID crisis, it has become so visible. It has become so shocking to know that depending on the color of your skin, depending on your gender, depending on where you come from, you might have more chances to be alive or not, to have access to health services, to have access to education, to be connected, to keep on living the life by teleworking and having, of course, harshest impact on those sectors and those group of people that have always been discriminated. And discrimination in the Arab region is also prevalent. It takes shapes in a variety of forms and has affected the different aspects of society, spanning from the dimensions from everyday life to work-related practices and legal frameworks. We know that anti-Black racism is widespread in many Arab nations, and it affects both migrant communities and Arabs of sub-Saharan African descent. We are proud to hear that Tunisia adopted a law on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. And I feel that this is also a platform to try to exchange good practices of what have worked and what have not. But Black communities are not the only victims of racial and structural discrimination in the Arab world, as this phenomena also affects other minority groups. And of course, it comes into acts of injustice, oppression, of categorization directed against a group of people that has to do with race, but that has also to do with religion. And sectarianism is present in the region, which has continued to divide religious communities, and that has really paved the way for discrimination and violence. What to say about women? You know better than anybody else around this table. Prevalent all over the world. Of course, we also see that COVID has been a magnifier of all the vulnerabilities that women experience in their lives, and the lack of support systems when this kind of shocks happen. The Arab region, unfortunately, remains among the lowest performing across the world in terms of global gender gap index. Gender-based violence, including domestic violence, rape, and other forms of sexual assault, sexual harassment, child and forced marriage continue to prevail in the region. And moreover, the ILO data in this region showed that women spend almost 5 times more hours than men on unpaid care and domestic work, especially related to child rearing. And of course, this has to do with stereotypes and role modeling for what is good for men and what is good for women. And it's reflected in the labor market. The rate of female labor force participation in this region is the lowest in the world at 18.4%. It's not only bad for women, but it's also bad for the economy because governments have invested in the education of girls and then they do not find a way to contribute to the economic growth and development. The global average for women participation is 48, which is very low, but still in the region you have even less than half of the global indicators. And then, of course, already the women that are in the labor force, only 11% hold managerial positions, which is lower than the average of 27%. And the political participation also very low. In Congress, it was 18% in 2017, the second lowest globally. And all of this is strengthened by the fact that by 2010, only 59% of women over 15 years were literate. And I know that they have increased their rate of participation in education, but again, it's low by international standards. And in addition to this gender-based discrimination and racism, migrant workers, again, they suffer from other forms of discrimination. As often they are excluded from labor law protections. We know this is an issue in many of the countries, and the fast-growing countries in the region, of course, attract a lot of labor migration, but then the protection is not there, and the abuses are also widespread. Migrant women who are usually employed as domestic workers are particularly vulnerable, and that victimization of migrant women continues to abound. And despite the ban on slavery, slave descendants in some countries still continue to face racism and discrimination. And structural discrimination against refugees, including those from Arab countries, is another important issue, which highlights the limitation placed on the enjoyment of several important rights. The Arab region, together with Turkey, is home to more than 6 million refugees and over 10 million internally displaced people fleeing violence. And I want to commend many countries in the regions who have been generous enough to host these refugees. But again, they also face a lot of discrimination. So this is the context. We don't want to have a somber outlook only. We know that countries in the region are making great progress. I myself, I was very pleased to meet with the Minister of Gender of Tunisia when she repealed the laws that impeded women to become privy to heritage and to eliminate laws that will force victims of rape to marry their aggressors. And so I know that there is a lot of very good progress. We know that Morocco has set up an intergovernmental commission to fight human trade, which is very important. And the International Organization of Migration provided assistance to officially reported victims of human trade. Within the Maghreb countries, awareness raising campaigns have been positively received. Many civil society organizations have continuously and strongly advocated for inclusion and non-discrimination, and progress in the legal framework is also achieved in many countries. So this is the context. The context is worrisome. The context is something that I'm sure you all agree we cannot accept, and UNESCO will not accept. And that's why we want to bring your knowledge, we want to bring your insights, and we are being called by our member states to look at how we can upscale the efforts and how we can bring innovative solutions and help the world move away from these discriminatory practices. So I wish you a great debate. I will be learning from you. As I said, this is the closing session, and we close with great speakers and inspiration, and I hope we will be able to build something that is meaningful to address this challenge we all confront. Thank you so much.
Un grand merci à Madame Gabriela Ramos.
Thank you very much, Madame Gabriela Ramos. And now I'd like to give the floor to our moderator, Mr. Beshar Al-Gawi. Over to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gabriela. Thank you, Anna. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Beshar Al-Gawi. I have the pleasure to moderate today's session, which is the last edition of a series of 6 regional consultations aimed to deconstruct racism and unpack the societal challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic related to racism and discrimination, and give actionable recommendations to guide Unesco's work together with its partners. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we have been witness to numerous reports in media about racially motivated acts and violence, including hate speech against populations who are discriminated against due to their skin color, ethnic origins, and religious beliefs. The I'm Not a Virus and the Black Lives Matter movement have created a resounding impact in various continents in the world, exposing previously existing prejudices and discriminations that have continued to plague our societies. The COVID-19 crisis also paved the way for scapegoating and brought to fore the resurgence of far-right movements that spread hate and violence. At the present conjuncture, the reawakening of the moral conscience and the increased global protests in different cities around the world have rekindled age-old racial wounds and further unveiled the disproportionate inequalities and injustice that these affected populations have endured. At this series, we aim at providing an in-depth contextual analysis through a regional perspective. This edition will focus on the Arab world. We have a distinguished panel speakers who have generously accepted to join us today for this consultation. Let me please welcome our speakers, Mr. Omar Fasatwi, Human Rights Officer, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Professor Charles Hareb, Professor of Social and Political Psychology at the American University of Beirut, Mrs. Khawla Ksiksi, co-founder of the Collective Voices of Tunisian Black Women from Tunis, Mrs. Nadia Miflah, author, film critic, and professor, producer at the Sahara Lab Institute, Mrs. Sadia Musbah, president of the Association Namti Against Discrimination in Tunisia. Thank you all for joining us today. Please first allow me to explain the format of our discussion for you and to our audience. The consultation will not take the form of a traditional roundtable discussion. Instead, with the objective of encouraging an interactive and dynamic discussion with the speakers, I will be asking you, esteemed speakers, questions and ask you to address them. Speakers are encouraged to react or comment on each other's interventions. This panel discussion will last for 1 hour. Then I will be asking the audience to raise questions through the Q&A box that is located on the bottom of your screen. This consultation series also aimed to result in a set of recommendations on the way forward for UNESCO. Therefore, towards the end of this debate, I will be asking each of the speakers to share 2 or 3 concrete recommendations. So thank you, everyone. And let me start, please, by the first set of questions. It's one question that I will be addressing to all speakers. So this discussion, I will have the chance to ask one specific question for each speaker later on. And let me also remind the public about the Q&A box at the bottom of their screen. So in order to set the framework of our debate this morning, I would like to ask everyone these 2 interconnected questions. First, how has racism evolved up to the current COVID-19 context? What intersectional discriminations are emerging and re-emerging during this crisis? Up to what extent have racial and gender-based discrimination converged? Let me start first with Mr. Charles Hareb from the American University of Beirut. What do you have, please, to say about these questions? And please, if you can stick to 3 minutes of your answer. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to address this panel. So this is a rather general and global question. And my sense is, and here I'm not talking with specific comparative data in terms of 10 years pre-COVID-19 and today, but my sense is that the general fault lines of discrimination that were already present in the Arab region are just simply exacerbated by this crisis, in the sense that the COVID-19 crisis has created a lot of stress on national infrastructures, socioeconomic factors, and so on. So tensions that were already present are simply manifesting themselves in even more exaggerated form. And they get to really extremes when it comes to specific vulnerable populations, because the scarcity of resources, the pressures on the structures have pushed people to become even more stringent about protecting their groups or their in-groups, and this has exacerbated tensions in general. There were some minor modifications or changes that happened at the beginning of the COVID-19 period, where people were discriminating against or feeling quite a bit of prejudice towards groups that were perceived as transmitters or vectors of COVID-19 within the communities. So, these migrant workers that are coming from abroad via planes are creating tensions, or people from this particular sectarian group or this particular ethnicity or this particular thing are actually introducing this epidemic into our communities, and they were perceived as a threat. But I think that with the passage of time and the fact that COVID-19 affected almost all communities in the same way, basically it shifted this early dynamic of blame to reassert again the same prejudices and discrimination that existed from early on. I'm happy to talk eventually later about effects on MBW, sectarianism, internal displacement, and so on, but I leave the floor to my colleagues as well.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Shar. So I leave the floor now for Mr. Omar Fasatwi. So what do you have to say in this regards? Do you have anything to add on what Professor Shars have already said?
Sure, mais je vais parler en français parce que...
I'm going to speak in French. There was a double impact of COVID. First of all, as a virus, COVID strengthened racism by adding a layer of xenophobia to it. The virus came from abroad in many countries, and so it became an illness from abroad, a foreign illness, which exacerbated xenophobia, especially towards foreigners who are already in the country. So, for example, in Tunisia, people who come from sub-Saharan Africa, but it also impacted people who were generally not discriminated against, people from Asia. The figures are not very important in Tunisia. It's not the same sort of issue as for sub-Saharan people. But during COVID, there was this fear of the foreigner bringing the virus into the country. And the second thing is the response to COVID. Not the virus itself, but the response that was given for the general lockdown, for example. The general lockdown affected these groups that were already discriminated against, especially when it comes to access certain rights and access to food, for example. We saw cases where foreigners did not have access to certain products that there was a shortage of. So this worsened the situation that was already on the situation that existed already. And we saw how the crisis and the response to COVID highlighted the reality of racism victims in their everyday reality. This is something that was not visible before for the state, for example, but the state saw how discrimination in daily life was reinforced during this COVID
Avant de
epidemic.
donner la parole maintenant à
Before
Madame
giving the
Nadia
floor
Meslah,
to
je
Madame
vais
Nadia
dire au
Meslah,
public qu'ils
I'd like to
peuvent
tell the
utiliser
speakers that they can
l'interprétation de
use
l'arabe à l'anglais ou
interpretation
bien
from Arabic
n'importe
to
quelle langue
English or
ils veulent
any other
choisir.
language they'd
I would
like
like to remind the audience
listen
that
to.
interpretation is available from English, Arabic, and French. They can choose the interpretation they need. بحب أذكر كل اللي عم يسمعونا إنه فيهم يسمعوا الترجمة من العربي للإنجليزي للفرنسي عبر الضغط على رابط الترجمة خلال Madame Nadia, what do you have to say in this regard to add on what Professor Charles and Mr. Omar have said? How have racial and gender-based discrimination converged from your experience, from what you have seen already? How has racism evolved up during COVID-19 crisis? You have to unmute your phone. Oui, Madame Nadia? You have to unmute your phone so we can, yes, we can listen to you now.
Donc, je souscrirai à ce qu'a dit Monsieur.
So I agree with that which Mr. Hareb and Mr. Omar said. I work in film, and it's a bit too early for me to be able to answer this question. I'll wait for movies to come out next year, but I'd like to remind you of a Tunisian film, Son of Mahdi Barsawi. That's the name of the title, and it came out in France a week before the lockdown in March 2020. It got an award at the Venice Film Festival last year, and in this movie, there's a couple who is a victim of a terrorist attack, and the child is grievously injured. And this child needs an organ transplant. And the film shows the trafficking in the Tunisian society that imagines itself as being white and Western, and they are trading in organs of Tunisian children, often sub-Saharan African children as well. This is a reality that is hardly ever shown, too rarely shown in movies, in North African movies. And this film really dealt with this reality of this African situation. So I keep thinking of this film, which is a first feature film that really shows this raw and cruel reality with this tragedy. What is the price of a black child's life compared to a white child's life, even though both children are African and Tunisian?
What you have said now allow me maybe to talk to Mrs. Khawla Ksiksi, who has founded recently an organization in Tunisia addressing this discrimination against Tunisian black people. So Mrs. Khawla, in this first round of questions, what do you have to tell us about the emerging of racism and the discrimination under this COVID-19 pandemic?
I'd like to react to what Omar said about the situation of black people, a situation which was already, the situation of black people was already critical before COVID. And it crossed with other vectors, with racism plus xenophobia plus sexism and so on and so forth, which created a situation of crisis, an added crisis to the health crisis we're going through. So, for example, when it comes to refugees who were living in Tunisia, they suffered different types of discrimination because they found themselves in a situation of economic difficulty. Since they belong to the working class, they work in restaurants and on construction sites, so they were deprived of their livelihoods. They were also excluded from the socially, because they were stigmatized by society, they were pushed aside by society, because during the crisis, there was an emergence of nationalism, that the message was that we wanted to protect our national resources and give it to Tunisians. And so there was, and also on top of that, the access to information for these people was very difficult because most information was in Arabic, and so there were language barriers. All these factors created a general feeling of frustration that was felt in different categories, and Black people were affected by this the most because they belong to the most marginalized and the poorest class in Tunisia.
Oui, c'est vraiment dommage, mais on va durant cette session peut-être terminer par des recommandations selon vos expertises. And now I get to Mrs. Saadia Misbah to end this first round of common question. So from what you have said, Mrs. Saadia, from what you have been seeing lately in your country, and maybe from what you are watching on TV or online, what are the emerging problems and related to discrimination and racism that you have witnessed emerging during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Bonjour et merci.
Good morning and thank you. There are two things that we have seen, for example, during the peak of this pandemic. And what we noticed is that in Tunisia, we didn't know the number of migrants that lived in the country. We were surprised. We were surprised because, well, I live in a small region where we don't really see these people. And strangely enough, in these operations, but I'm talking about different aid operations that were implemented during COVID, we noticed there are more than 300 sub-Saharan families living in this community, in this very small region. People who were invisible to us, people who went to work very early in the morning, came home very late at night. And so there's something very important. The pandemic happened during Ramadan, and as you know, during Ramadan, Muslims are a bit more generous than usual for all the reasons that you know very well and that we all know. And so there was a feeling of solidarity. And this happened right during Ramadan. The money that people will give out, the food that people will share with others, these are things that are no longer the case today because it's no longer Ramadan. So people will no longer be able to give what they gave 3 or 4 months ago to the needy. And that's what I've noticed. And another thing, racism in Tunisia, it's had 3 phases. First, it's always been denied. There's been a denial. But then in 2003, there was the arrival of the African Development Bank. And this raised the curtain on all the different forms of discrimination that existed in the area. In Tunisia, we were not used to seeing rich Black people. We could see him as a waiter or as a manual laborer, but we were not used to seeing rich Black people with a big car directing a bank. And so that was the beginning of a change. That was something that we had to face very quickly. And unfortunately, we dragged our feet because we didn't have the means to talk about these issues. And then the other big change was in 2010, 2011, when we learned to talk about this and we were able to talk about the Black question, even though it was just words. And despite all the advances, there is still a great amount of denial because there hasn't been a serious debate. There hasn't been any serious vision of what we'll do, how we'll act. And that is the problem of racism in
Merci,
Tunisia.
madame. Merci
Thank
à
you.
vous tous. Donc,
Thank you to all
from
of
what you
you.
have all said till now, we can definitely say that there is an increase in racism that was already existing, but the COVID-19 pandemic has maybe shed the light over it. And this leads me to the next set of questions, which will be more targeted based on your expertise and your field of work. And I would like to remind you, if at any point you would like to comment on each other's, to add on what a panelist is saying, please feel free to unmute yourself and intervene. So let me start by Mr. Omar. Omar, I would like to remind that Mr. Omar Fassatwi is the Human Rights Officer at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Donc, Monsieur Omar, vous avez une longue expérience de travail avec les décideurs politiques.
Experience in work with political decision makers.
Yeah. No, pas de problème. I'm trying to use the 3 languages so I can accommodate for all the audience, and maybe at the end we نحكي بالعربي هيك بس نضيع الانتربريتاسيون so عم جرب.
We shouldn't waste the interpretation, so I'm trying to speak a little bit in English, a bit in French, and a bit in Arabic.
Expérience de travail avec les décideurs politiques
so you have
de la
région.
Quelles sont les meilleures pratiques que vous pouvez partager dans la lutte contre le racisme et la discrimination?
Combating racism and discrimination. Well, for the region, well, I'd talk more about Tunisia or North Africa, but I'd like to talk about specific features of Arabic countries in Africa, and often, unfortunately, they're in denial. And in North Africa, we've got a situation where we're neither Middle East nor Asia, where Africa and the identity is often concealed or ignored. Unfortunately, the Tunisian constitution does not talk about this element of Tunisian identity. It just talks about it being Mediterranean, African, or North African, but not the whole continent. And for a long time, Tunisia was part of Africa as a continent. So I'd like political decision makers to deal with this question of racism. It's not easy because, well, after the revolution in Tunisia, this doesn't seem to be a priority. There are more pressing economic problems. And people think it's just a problem which concerns the victims, but that's completely wrong, because racism concerns the entire society, those who practice it and those who are subject to it, and even those who are silent. That's even more serious. We've seen that a number of people, whether it's racism or sexual harassment in the street, feel a bit awkward about responding, or they say, I'm not concerned by that. It's not me. I'm really not concerned by it. Now, for political decision makers, one of the things we've done is to have consultations. We've had politicians meet the victims, and that way we can get them together, because otherwise they're in completely separate spheres of society. And we have them living in the same country, so they have to come together. So we give victims the opportunity to speak out. And they're usually people who do not have access to the media, or they do not have any high profile. There was support, for example, from the High Commissioner's office, and there was an invitation in Parliament, and we have ministers, and we're lucky to have a Minister for Human Rights who was invited to look at the question of racism as seen by victims, as seen by majority groups, of course, but also as seen by those who have to contend with it on a daily basis. At this stage in my life, I'd say there was a key moment when there was a governor who was in complete denial. He said, there's no such thing as racism in my governorate. And we got him in contact with a direct victim. And he said, go and tell that to my daughters who've been victims of racism. I think we obviously have to take action with politicians. in Tunisia, the discriminated groups now have access to politics and have gained a certain level of visibility. Of course, if you have a black politician, then it's a way of doing away with the racist stereotypes where people think that all blacks are inferior. It shows that black people can be elected. And we obviously have to grasp opportunities that arise at an international level when there are reports at the United Nations, or if you have a visit from an independent expert. People are very interested in getting this type of message, and if we can provide data, it's very good. Another good thing that was done is having a policy based on figures, based on evidence. Unfortunately, in the Arab region, we don't have a lot of statistical data.
Ça me laisse réfléchir à une question qu'on
This
suppose que
leads
les
us
politiques
to a
sociales
question
pourraient être
where we
mieux
might
développées
think
en utilisant
that
une base
social
de
policies could be
preuves, par
better developed
exemple des
if
données,
there
des
was some form
statistiques.
of evidence-based
Comment ces
approach.
bases de données
If you
que
had
vous
the
venez
evidence,
de
how
mentionner
could you get
peut-elles
databases
être
or
établies
statistics, as
et
you
les
just
lacunes
mentioned?
comblées en
How could
l'absence de
they be
données afin
set
de
up,
développer de
given that there
politiques
are so
sociales
many shortfalls or
efficaces?
total absence of data in some position? They obviously have to be used to develop effective social policies. I'd also like to answer a question which is in the Q&A form. Now, we get figures from civil society. It's not the state that provides the statistics. Unfortunately, it's not part of our national culture. We have a different form of where we have oral culture and hand-on messages. But if you want to get statistics on the ethnic breakdown of Arab societies, it would at least provide proof that the people are there, that they do exist. And I have a problem with the term Arab world because there are a number of different Arab worlds. You have to see differences as well as similarities. And a study was done on the impact of racism and the fact that sub-Saharan students don't come to certain countries. And when you see the impact on the economy, you have to be aware of it. But if you say that there's an economic impact because these students don't come to the country, people might see the economic impact because it's money they don't get. But you also need to have the figures so that you can have a proper integration policy. You have to be able to prove that it's 1% or an exact percentage of the population. And you need to have studies of racism in school and school dropouts because of racist approaches. So if we don't have these studies and statistics, then I can't know what the phenomenon is and how extensive it is. So we need to do work, whether it's us, the United Nations, politicians or others, but we really need to have the figures and the analysis of the phenomenon. And we just can't say there's just one case a year. And even if there were only one case a year, it's one case too many. But the cases that get into the media are just the tip of the iceberg. And there are lots of hidden problems that don't make it to the media. Now, I don't know if I can answer questions now, if I should answer them later.
À la fin, mais si c'est lié à ce que vous venez de dire,
but if it's related to what you've said, you could pick up on it now.
Pour ne pas perdre le fil des idées.
Now, I'd like to answer the question about belonging to the African Union. Now, Tunisia belongs to the African Union, of course, and was even the head of the African Union when there were problems in Côte d'Ivoire. But unfortunately, this is a political association, and you don't see it in any visible way in policies or for the people. In everyday life in Tunisia, Tunisian people don't identify with the word African. When you say Africans, they think of Black people. Whereas Tunisians are Africans, and we really need to work on that. We need to work on it in school textbooks and in the way we teach history.
Je voudrais répondre à Imen également.
Now, I'd also like to answer Imen here. Perhaps we're somewhere between black and white, but I think Tunisians consider themselves to be white and prefer to identify with Arab groups or Islam groups sometimes. But there's another group. If you go away from African identified Tunisians forget the main native group, which is the Amnesia group. We are the only North African country not recognizing that identity. And most Tunisians say they are Arabs. And even the political identity, which was created, it was set up in the constitution. You open the constitution to see what we are, and you see that we're an Arab Muslim country. Yes, you're quite right. And perhaps I can point out that that's not just related to Tunisia, but to all Arab countries in North Africa. I'll come back to you to discuss the question of international organizations later. But as we're talking about Tunisia and discrimination and the situation of blacks,
and I would like to remind that Mrs. Khawla is the co-founder of the Collective Voices of Tunisian Black Women Program North African Office. From what Mr. Omar has already said and elaborated about, a few months ago, you co-founded this feminist anti-racist group called Voice of Black Tunisian Women, specifically regarding women, ou bien en français, Voix des femmes noires tunisiennes. What are the objectives of this group, and why specifically you have chosen to target the women? And as Mr. Omar has said, this is a problem that is emerging among all groups, not only women. Can you please elaborate more about this organization and the objective behind it?
En fait, bien sûr que le racisme touche tous les Noirs.
Of course, racism affects all Black people in Tunisia, but you can see a hierarchical ranking, and you can see that women are the weakest link in the whole ranking. Basically, they think that Black women have specific problems compared to non-Black women in Tunisia. So we set up our collective. It's not an association yet, it's just a collective. And it was to have a safe space for Black women where they could speak out about their problems, which are often taboo, because the subject of discrimination in Tunisia is considered to be taboo, and Blacks did not have any possibility of raising this issue in politics or even in society. Usually when Black people speak out, they are really subject to a huge attacks. And so we wanted to have a base where Black women could speak out, talk about their problems without being judged. And we also wanted to set up a feeling of solidarity between Black women, because we'd never been brought together. So the first objective was to have a safe space for Black people to talk about their problems, because if we don't talk about them, we'll never be able to solve them. The second objective was to build up knowledge on the issue. As Omar has just said, we don't have the data. And as we don't have any data, we can't convince the authorities of just how great the problem is. So if we're not in a situation where we can record data and get statistics in a new organization, we thought we had to get knowledge on issues, have debates, get different tools that could gather together the knowledge so that we could explain the problem of Black women in Tunisia and get it across. So that was the idea. It was awareness raising. We wanted to raise awareness on the specific problems of Black women in Tunisia, because, as I said, all women in Tunisia are subject to violence and discrimination, and all Black people are also subject to discrimination. But when you have both types of discrimination that come together, you get a different effect, which is there in everyday life for Black women in Tunisia. For example, victimization, stigmatization, or hypersexualization. And Black women are seen as sex objects, and there's stigmatization of Black women. They're considered that they have to work or that they should be put in a certain setting, and there are bans on them being involved in other parts. It's almost an institutional ban. So you can see there are areas where blacks are excluded in general and black women in particular. They're excluded from any decision-making areas. You don't see them in the media or in any central roles in Tunisian society. And so this then brings us to the last objective of our collective, which is to give greater strength to black women, to empower them and get them off the fringe of society into mainstream society so that they can really exist in Tunisian society today, because they've really been relegated into certain areas. They're marginalized in every way. They're almost made invisible. And I think we have a democratic climate now, which means we can actually do something. We can raise awareness on the rights of black women in particular. So that in general are the objectives of the collective.
Thank you. And I can see there are lots of questions already in the Q&A box, but before answering the questions, and some of them are addressed directly to Mr. Omar since he started this panel. But first, I would like to move to Professor Charles Hareb, as a professor of social and political psychology at the American University of Beirut. We have listened to the experience of Mr. Omar, of Mrs. Khawla, but as part of your work as an academician on social, political, and intergroup dynamics in the Arab region, not only in Lebanon, you conducted researches in Lebanon, Iraq, Tunisia. How do you assess racism in the Arab world, and what social policies have proven to be effective in the fight against racism and discrimination?
I'm not sure about addressing the second part of the question, which is which policies have been effective, because I don't think there has been a lot of policies that have been implemented or an assessment of their impact in the first place. One thing I'd like to note, especially when I listen to my colleagues on the panel, I think it is important to note or remember that basically we're talking about the Arab region as if it is one entity, as if it is one unit. And I think that the dynamics and the concerns that are present in some of the Arab countries are not necessarily shared with other parts or other countries in the Arab region who have different kind of concerns and dynamics and discrimination. So yes, of course, the big three in terms of sexism, gender discrimination, sexuality and gender identity, ethnicity and race are relatively prevalent across. But the dynamics that are, or the problems that are affecting society or societal dynamics in the Maghreb, for example, are a bit different from the ones that are in the Nile Valley all the way to Sudan, that are different from what's happening in the Gulf region, which are also different from the discrimination and problems that are affecting societies within the Fertile Crescent. So it would be important to basically, if you really want to tackle these issues of racism, to be a bit more sensitive of the dynamics and history of the social fabric and the networks that are in those particular locations, to see what is also particularly problematic for those communities rather than depictions as a whole. So for example, Amazigh, black racism issues associated with North Africa may not necessarily be of relevance to dynamics that are happening in the Fertile Crescent, where sectarianism, religious-based discrimination is a bit more concerning in terms of the cost to societal stability. The other thing that brought to my mind when I was listening to my colleagues is the distinction that we have in terms of the complexity that we have in understanding discrimination based on race of black versus white. So the literature in Western societies is looking at this in a completely different way than the way we have in terms of history with people of different shades of color within the Arab and Islamic kind of world. And the way we approach this might need to, or would require actually a bit more study. So our relationship within our own communities with people who are of different skin colors may not be necessarily the same as the relationship between white individuals and enslaved people that have been migrating to the US or Europe. So there might be some kind of a recommendation, basically, to look at really how do we perceive, how do we think about individuals of different skin color in our region, how does it fit in our narrative, so that we can eventually address it in a way that is not directly imported from the literature that we have in the general stream. So these are some of the main points that I wanted to address in terms of race-based discrimination as opposed to other forms of discrimination that are present in our region.
Yes, Professor, you mentioned minorities like the Amazigh and other, but in our region, hundreds of thousands are minorities, be it migrants, refugees. So considering these data and your researchers on the ground, how do you think racism and discrimination have evolved in the region in the past 10 years, which is not a very long period, but just to let us know, what do you think and what can be done to address it?
So this is, for example, a very interesting region-specific kind of issue, which is, for example, the issue of internally displaced populations and refugees, Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees. You can't necessarily recognize them by their skin color. They have the same skin color. The language is the same, minor dialectical variations. But at the same time, these communities, so we're not talking about visible criteria that are there to discriminate against a particular person of a different ethnicity or skin color. But these individuals are suffering intense discrimination, especially in places like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and so on, where we had an influx of, for example, displaced persons from Syria. And this is discrimination that is not racism, but it's just a more global form of treating people differently, putting them under duress, exploiting them, and so on, just simply because of where they're coming from, which is the greater umbrella of discrimination. And we can see a lot of efforts that are being done by grassroots organizations, international NGOs and states and donors to try to reconcile the differences between these groups or these intergroup dynamics. And unfortunately, some are actually exacerbating tensions because they are based on theories that are not supported by data to resolve tensions and conflicts within our particular region. So we see sometimes interventions that are there to bring two groups into contact, but the contact is asymmetric in such a way that basically is going to exacerbate hatred, prejudice, discrimination against these individuals, and then people go back to their own cocoon of preconceptions about the other group, and tensions continue to flare up. So racism is just one part of discrimination, and racism in terms of race is one part, and we need to look at the Arab region in a more pressing way to identify what needs to be solved and how to solve them. My colleagues also mentioned the fact that there's an absence of data. There's an absence of basic data, like, for example, demographics, gender, age, location, race, ethnicity, sectarian, and so on and so forth. And this is the basic, the groundwork that we can build upon. But there's also a huge lack of information in terms of social science studies on understanding intergroup dynamics. How do they manifest themselves in our region? How can we tackle them? What is the best way to approach them and to break that kind of tension that exists within groups within these kind of diverse region that we have?
Interesting. Thank you, Professor Charles. And before heading to our next panelist, Mrs. Nadia Miflah, to listen to the artistic and cinematic part of this issue, there are some questions that Mr. Omar would like to answer from the audience. And I would like to ask Mr. Omar to be as brief as possible to be able to address the other question. And I would like to remind everyone from the audience to ask their questions in the Q&A box. So from what you have said, Mr. Omar, there is a question. C'est intéressant cette expérience qui a consisté à donner la voix aux victimes des pratiques discriminatoires en Tunisie.
To victims of discriminatory practices in Tunisia, but I'd like to know if these repressive actions do discourage people from these practices. Can you tell us something about this? So there was a law that was adopted 2 years ago that imposes prison terms for racist acts, be they moral persons or individuals. So there's repression of racism that has been adopted, but there has to also be prevention. We have to work on prevention, because putting people in prison for racist acts without changing their mindsets is quite dangerous and useless. For Annelie's questions on anti-Semitism, I'd like to answer it because there is anti-Semitism in the Arab world, of course, but it's very politicized. In Tunisia, there are Tunisian Jews who even had held political office. But you can read on Facebook lots of anti-Semitic comments and also sympathy for anti-Semitic acts that happen in other countries. But this isn't something that really affects Tunisians in the country. It's more linked to international news.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Omar. So again, I would like to remind everyone to ask their questions in the Q&A box, because I see some hands raised. So people who are raising your hands, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. So maintenant à Madame Nadia.
Now
Madame
Nadia.
est film critique.
Madame Nadia is a film critic
producer
and
Sahara Lab
producer
Institute.
at the
Donc,
Sahara Lab Institute.
Quel rôle joue le cinéma? Vous avez entendu Professor Charles, Mr. Schawla, Mr. Omar. Il y a plein de problèmes,
talk about
apparemment.
various
Donc,
issues.
quel rôle joue le cinéma
But what is the role
pour
of
accentuer
cinema
cette
to
amnésie,
build
si
and
on peut dire?
accentuate
Selon vous, quel rôle pourrait avoir le cinéma pour transformer les
situation? What role
imaginaires
could
et
cinema have to
lutter contre les
transform the
discriminations?
imaginary and to fight against
Pas
discrimination?
facile, je crois.
I don't think it's something that's very easy, is it? No, it's not easy. Every society needs to be able to tell its story. And fiction, the national novel, one could say, is something that's fundamental. And one of the strengths of film is that it's a popular art, a people's art. You don't need to read or write to understand it. And so it's got a political strength. It's something that's accessible, financially speaking. Buying a book or going to the opera or the theater is not the same as being able to go to the cinema. The cinema, the movie theater, I'm not talking about screens or televisions, but the cinema itself, the physical space, it is a place that is most savagely democratic. And I mean savagely in the sense that all social classes are mixed together. There's no distinction in the different class of tickets. And if there is a distinction, then the price differences are very small. The strength of movies is very powerful. And politicians are aware of this. Unfortunately, in North African countries, but not only in North African countries, also in other parts of the world, there is a certain rarefaction. And there's a problem for distributing works, because there is cinematic creativity, there is film creativity. But if I take the 4 countries of the Maghreb region, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, there's a problem with access. Audiences want to watch films and they see them on television, but cinema is unfortunately, when it comes to distribution within countries, it is an industry that was dismembered and torn apart for many different reasons. But film is very important, especially when it comes to the issue of having a critical approach of a topic that takes into account all the different stories. And what I've really been touched by, what resonates with me, is this idea of the war, of this identity war, this memory war, that is still relevant in countries who consider themselves to be absolutely Arabic, as if being Arabic was a sort of ideological passion. And they blatantly deny their Africanness, the fact that they are African. Of course, this is the African continent. So there's sort of confusion, an active confusion, that is supported by narratives, memorials, and so on. and all the different Arabic nationalist movements. And you're right to say that there are different forms of Arab nationalism. Mr. Hareb has stated this very well. It's a great shame that the films of these Arab cultures, the things that they show, that they represent, when it comes to this history, this memory of Africanness, I still think it is catastrophic how far behind filmmakers are, and producers as well as scriptwriters and actors. There's, in most cases, there are still stereotypes, discriminatory stereotypes. There's an invisibility, a very obvious invisibility of stories, of narratives, of actors from a black background or from an African background, with some exceptions. But these exceptions are always on the sidelines somewhere in art films, for example, films such as C.S. Grenadine by Mahmoud Ben Ahmoud, who is a Tunisian filmmaker, or more recently, there was Alain Slin with The Last of Us, which I think is one of the few, or maybe the only film from North Africa where the main character is played by a black actor who's at the heart of the story. And even if this is outside of the Maghreb in the Arab region, there's an amazing work by Sudanese filmmakers, Tree of Lives, Khartoum Offside, or We Will Die at 20, which was awarded internationally. The urgent issue, which you brought up, the lack of statistics in science of demographic data, but I think above all, it's the ownership of these narratives, of these stories that's important. Even the sad stories, the painful stories, the history of slavery, that still pollutes the imagination even today in people who consider themselves to be Arab. Someone asked a question about anti-Semitism. I'll give you an example. In Europe, there's still a lot of work to be done, but we have worked on this collective memory and how could European countries actively participate in the destruction of the Jews of Europe. This is a work of memory that is absolutely essential. When I'm working in different countries, I go to different festivals in Morocco, in Algeria. I've also worked in Tunisia. And of course, they have different national histories, but they do have something in common, and that is their hatred, their denial, their amnesia, their refusal towards Black people, because Black people represent the other. It is them opposed to us. And they do not consider themselves African. And this is something you find in films, in fiction. This is absolutely true, what you've just said. And this actually makes me think of my next question, which I'd like to ask Madame Saadi Mosba, and then maybe I'll come back to all of you for a last question about the role of organizations, of international organizations such as UNESCO in this regard. So, Madame Sadia, you are the president of the Mnamti Against Discriminations Association.
Madame Nadia a mentionné l'esclavage. Donc, malgré l'abolition de l'esclavage en 1846, le racisme n'a pas disparu de nos sociétés, et c'est mondial, pas seulement chez nous. Comment s'exprime pour vous le racisme aujourd'hui, et comment a-t-il évolué pendant les dernières décennies?
I'd like to first of all go back to the consequences of our history, because they created the systemic barriers that stop certain people, especially Black people, from participating fully in all spheres of society. Today, how have we evolved since 1846? So over 170 years later, Ines Murad Deli, a sociologist, said that the black people went from slavery to servitude. This hasn't changed that much. This means that prejudice and the stereotypes that black people have to deal with these prejudices haven't really changed because there isn't really any political willpower, any social will to change this situation. And in order to change things, I think we first of all need to know what the needs are. We need to have a real diagnosis of our society. This is something that hasn't been done. And today, this is something that is taken care of by civil society, and they do not have many resources. So how can we eliminate these differences, these inequalities? So I think it would be interesting to work on people's experiences, on black people's experiences. In Tunisia, black people are concentrated in the south of the country. So it's a bit easier there. There's fewer black people in Tunis and in big cities. But if you go to the south of the country, you can have a very specific, you can see the situation very clearly. There are cities where there are 7,000 people who live in total autarky, and they've been living that way for 200 years. Will this have a negative effect on public health tomorrow with these marriages, these incestuous relationships, people who live in the same closed circle? So there's a lot of work to be done, and things are not changing a lot. They haven't changed a lot, even though today Tunisia is one of the first countries to have eradicated slavery in the Arab world, but we haven't really made that much progress. In the last 10 years, it's been even more difficult because we've seen the massive arrival of migrants. And we don't know why they're coming to Tunisia. We haven't asked ourselves the question, why are they leaving their countries? Why are they coming to Tunisia? Yes, Tunisia is on their way to Europe, but it's not only a country of passage. And when we work with our migrant brothers, we realize there are other questions one has to ask oneself in order to solve this issue. I think it is high time today, right now, to think about this, and that we should meet it to implement some strategies that we could follow. We each work in our own field of expertise. We do what we can, but it's not enough. Today, it is absolutely imperative to sit around the same table with cinematographers, artists, because art will help us move forward, with psychologists, with anthropologists, and we'll truly have to set up a small commission, or maybe a large commission actually, to be able to see where we stand and to be able to deal with each issue and make progress, because we can't make any progress without a strategy. It's not possible.
Évidemment. Donc, avant de procéder avec les Q&A, parce que nous avons encore à peu près une quinzaine de minutes. Maintenant, I would like to focus now on an important aspect of policy making, which is the need for data and evidence to support these policies. You all mentioned that we lack the data, we lack the numbers, we don't work by numbers in this region of the world, and there is a gap of consolidated and analytic data in many parts of the world, not only here on racism and discrimination. And there is a lot of work to be done to enhance this evidence base. How can these gaps be filled in order to effectively establish social policies that address these issues? Who would like to answer this question specifically? It's open to any of the panelists to feel free. Mr. Omar.
Je profite, ça va me permettre également
I'd like to take this opportunity because I'll also be able to answer one of the questions from the chat. And that's the implementation of public policies. I think that is the solution. That would be the most efficient solution, I think. Because first of all, in Tunisia, there's a law that establishes a national commission to fight against racial discrimination, which will have to review public policy and educational programs and to see whether in public policy, whether there is an active form of racism. But there's also passive racism, the fact that you do not include victims of racism in public policies, to not see them, to look the other way. But we're asking at the UN, we would like Tunisia to be able to allow people to self-identify in surveys, for example. So if there's a when there are these kinds of censuses, people should be able to identify themselves. And then another issue is that this commission needs resources, and if it doesn't have a good budget, it won't be able to work. So if we have a commission without a budget, that is something that is quite problematic, which means that if it doesn't have the means to work, this commission will not be able to do anything. Victims need these policies because these victims need to realize that they're at the heart of these policies, for them to be able to not only go to court to be able to sue people for racist issues, but also to show in public programs that there is an interest for these questions. As Madam said, TV, cinema, these are very democratic tools, but there are very few people who are different from the majority group who appear on television. So if these people are not seen on television, in school books, in advertising, it's obvious that in the collective imagination, they will not belong to the national makeup. And this is something that keeps going on now. When you see ads in the Arab world, very often shampoos do not really correspond to the kind of hair that people have. The people in the ads, we see a lot of blonde people and redheads to sell us shampoo, where in countries in the Arab world and in the Maghreb, the male and female ideal, we have to see how it's presented. And we need to have studies to see how we perceive ourselves and how we're perceived by others. And I think we're just at the beginning of this route, and we have a lot of work to do.
If I can make a comment there on basic images and the way we see things. Now, there are things that can be done in a very modest way, and this is what we do with our South-South partnership in Sahara Lab. Now, each citizen can have their own narrative, and we can start with video workshops, telling stories. This is a way of educating people to see pictures, to see images, and the way people see us. And each person can then adopt their position and determine their own story. And you can do this in a short video, and we can have these for young people and for adults too. And this question of our self-image may be a part of the answer to the question asked by the participant. And I'm talking here about civil education and how cinema can be used
Très bien,
as a
donc je vais
tool for
prendre
that.
encore deux questions de notre public avant de terminer par les recommandations de nos panélistes. Donc, préparez 2 minutes de recommandations concrètes. La question suivante, c'est à Madame Khawla Siti. Donc, la Tunisie a adopté une loi d'élimination pour toutes les formes de discrimination en 2018. Cette loi, de quoi il s'agit et quels sont les actes de discrimination raciale qui sont perpétués? Est-ce que vous pouvez nous parler brièvement à propos de cette loi spécifique et est-ce qu'elle est appliquée?
Legislation and whether it is actually enforced? Well, this legislation was passed in 2018. There were two parts that you can see to it. There's one part to protect victims, and there are special measures there to punish people who practice racial discrimination. And then there's another part which is more preventive approach. It's more education or awareness raising, and it's part of a general strategy on racial discrimination. Now, the legislation has been adopted, and I think the first part is more or less effective because you have to see what happens. But of course, not all Black people in Tunisia can have access to the courts because they're in poor situations. And now it's 2 years after the legislation was passed, but we're a long way off getting a national strategy on racial discrimination. Because if we really want to get rid of it in Tunisia, we have to start with education programs. We have to implement a proper policy on discrimination and the different groups who've suffered discrimination for centuries. The media needs to have a policy to encourage better representation in the media. We need to see Black people also in arts productions and in textbooks, as Mr. Omar Fassatoui said, because we don't see Blacks in these positions in Tunisia. So the second part of the legislation has not really been enforced. There's the Commission to Combat Racism and Discrimination. It's currently being set up, as I said, 2 years after the legislation was passed. Now, the law is fine. It's good to have a legislative text there to deal with racism and discrimination. But I think there's a deep-seated problem in society, and it can't just be solved by legislation. And you can't put everybody in prison. My personal opinion is that we need to get civil society and state institutions moving so that a proper, complete strategy is implemented to deal with racism and discrimination. Mr. Omar, did you want to add a comment? No. You can say through legislation, we could look at collecting data because legislation requires that records be kept of all complaints filed in different courts. So we should know how many cases have been found in the courts over the course of a year. And that will give us some figures which will put us in a better position to deal with the problem. Even the figures, as mentioned by Ms. Xixi, there are people who don't have access to the courts. We mustn't just work on law, but we have to work on access to justice and the courts.
Et tous
So
qui
thank
ont
you.
posé leurs
And
questions dans
thank
le
you.
Q&A,
Thank you to you
mais parce
all
qu'on a une limitation
asked your
de temps,
questions in the Q&A forum,
right now I would
but
like
we
to
don't
give
have
back
much
the
time.
floor to each of the speakers. After these exchanges, it's now your turn to give us your recommendation on the way forward, specifically your recommendations towards UNESCO and to its networks. So I'm giving 2 minutes for each of you to give us your concrete recommendation. Shall I start by Professor Charles?
So recommendations to UNESCO, that's a bit of a big wish list kind of thing. I'll just try to focus on 2 main points out of the whole list. The first one is to think about approaching racism and discrimination in our region in a bit more culturally specific way and sensitive way. Each area has its own problems, and it's manifested in different ways. So tailoring strategies of intervention that take these into consideration is likely to optimize the impact of that kind of intervention rather than using general formulas for sub-regions or regions in general. The second one is that there's I recognize that there's very little data, or sometimes we talk about little data about the Arab region, but actually there is data. There is data that is distributed here and there. It's really good to collect them. And there's been a lot of studies that have been done on discrimination and prejudice in our region that could be very useful and that go beyond the standard strategies of contact, support, and these kind of things. I look at, for example, management of social identities, recategorization, cross-cutting identities, which are strategies that have been empirically supported to try to reduce discrimination, racism, and sexism in our region and more globally. So to be a bit more in line with what's happening in the academic literature to support evidence-based solutions and recommendations.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And now, Madame Nadia, vos recommandations, s'il vous plaît.
Your recommendations, please. Well, we make recommendations to yourself first. I think it's extremely important to provide support and encouragement for all our action with partnerships that are South-South relations for countries on the African continent, doing this through culture, because each citizen has their story, they have their imagination. We need to deconstruct things, we need to take ownership of things and rebuild things in a critical way, so that each person can be their own storyteller. I'm always struck by the different levels of amnesia we have in action when we look at collective memories. And I think that cultural action, action in the arts, includes all levels, whether it's political, social, political, or educational. And it's easy access. It's a form of emancipation. It's very liberating experience, and you can do it even as children when they're very young. Because there's great loneliness that I feel when I go through some countries in Africa, but there's also a great ambition to come together and do things together. There are stories to be told, and they must be told. So that is my wish, and perhaps my advice, my call for an educational, cultural, and artistic action. And of course, that appeals to us all. It's a message for us all. And often this is an initiative by private partners, and they're quite separate from any public support.
Madame Sadia Mousbah, vos recommandations, s'il vous plaît.
What are your recommendations, please? Well,
yes,
the term recommendation is a bit too lofty for me.
On your shoulders.
Are there monitoring measures? Now, if we set up strategies, we have to monitor them, and we have to see them in countries and the specific situation in the country concerned, because you don't have racism, which is the same in all Arab countries. You have different forms of racism. So we need to know what types of monitoring could be made available, perhaps through UNESCO, to help the different countries move ahead and do the great deal of work that needs to be done. We need to have these follow-up measures and monitoring measures for each country, depending on its specific situation.
Madame Khawla, avant de terminer avec Monsieur Omar. Donc, quelles sont vos recommandations ou vos vœux, vos espoirs?
Recommendations, or what would you wish or hope for? Well, my hopes, and I have plenty. I can't add much more to what's already been said. I'd like to stress 3 points. Now, the setting up cultural and artistic work for a culture of inclusion and diversity. It's so important for people to have the possibility of having discussions such as this one we're having here. We need to decentralize things and go out and meet the people concerned, those who are affected. We shouldn't monopolize the debate, just keeping it in one part of society which is interested in the issue. The second point is education. We need to have curricula and programs for children, teenagers, and other young people, because the culture of diversity is something that you learn when you're very young. If you live in a society where people hide Black people away and make them invisible, we'll never be able to create a proper inclusive environment. And I would recommend activities and actions to revive African heritage and all Black people in Tunisia, because we've got a real problem with our Africanness, our African identity. We tend to erase everything which ties us to the African continent, to our African heritage, but it's there and we try to forget it. Even tales of slavery and what happened in the time of slavery in Tunisia, we pretend that that never existed. And I think we need to have recognition of history so that we can move ahead.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, to Mr. Omar, maintenant.
Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Omar,
Now,
before
Mr.
ending our session with Mrs. Anna Maria, what are your recommendations? Would you like to name them recommendations? First of all, Mr. Omar. Yeah.
It can be recommendation, wishes, whatever.
Yes.
Je dirais vraiment, vu que c'est à l'UNESCO qu'on s'adresse, je pense que...
Since we're talking at UNESCO, I think that we should include a topic on slavery, on racism, on living together in educational policies in the curricula in Arab countries, from primary school to onwards up to university. These topics should be part of the schooling system, and they should be developed in a sort of regional curriculum that would be implemented in the Arab world. I think we should also identify the best practices that work in Tunisia or in other countries. I can't say that my country has the exclusive ownership of these policies. I'd like to know what's happening in different contexts in the Arab world. And a third thing would be to develop tools that people could easily use, things that are more accessible. Because as Madame Sisi said earlier on, we should not allow racism to just be limited, the discussions of racism to be limited only to people who are interested in this. So I think everyone should work in order to make people understand in the Arab world, to the people who live there, that diversity isn't a Western luxury. Our countries are very diversified. But we celebrate diversity in Sweden or the USA or Brazil, but we see this diversity as something that exists somewhere else. But actually, diversity exists in our own societies. So maybe one more recommendation is we need to have debates on diversity, and these debates should lead to appeasing people and not to conflict. We need to build together and not build against people or try to take their place. There's enough space for everyone. And I'd like to invite UNESCO to better give a voice to people who can't express themselves. So I think the relationship between the Arab world and Africa, at least virtually, we need to remove the geographic borders from this.
It's a great ending of our discussions today. Thank you for all the speakers, for your enriching testimonials today. We feel really inspired by your ideas and recommendations, and I'm sure that UNESCO will gather all your inputs. So to close our consultation today, I would like to re-invite Mrs. Anna Maria Machlos, the Inclusion and Rights Section Chief at UNESCO, to deliver the closing remarks.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Al-Gawi, for a job really well done. And thank you to all the great speakers for your analysis and forward-looking recommendations and even innovative recommendations. that you have provided on a topic that is really crucial to all of us and in all the regions on the world, especially taking into account the current context. As you know, this was our last expert consultations, and all of them that we had before, including this one, really allowed us to better understand which are the best practices, learnings, and policies against discrimination, including gender-based discrimination, and also to what extent slavery and racism are intertwined. The importance of promoting culture, including film, of course, as a means to combat racism. The role that young women and men can play in combating racism and discrimination. And very important, the urgent need to also fill the data and information gap, not only in the Arab region, but in all the region. So though your recommendations and all the questions that were asked by our very active audience will contribute to the elaboration of a roadmap that will guide UNESCO's work in the future. We will also develop practical online and offline tools. So I say once again, thank you to all of you, and I hope that we will stay in touch. Have a nice day. Bonne journée à vous tous et toutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Thank you
Au
very
revoir.
much.
Bye.
Goodbye.